share Professor Chintamani Mahapatra. His introduction described him as expert on American studies. I think I need to underline that he himself has traveled extensively in China, has spent time in China, and also well known in China himself. So I thought that part was missing in Chair's introduction, and I should share as a friend of the Chair. Professor Andy Mathur, the Director of School of Humanities and Social Sciences, and the team of Manipal University at Jaipur, especially Radhika and Aryan. Also compliments to Jaslok Dialogue for arranging this conversation for us. I'll spend my 8 minutes looking at what is the mandate, past, present, and future, and try to underline what is that is constantly sustaining this perennial tension between the two states. And I like the way Shaktiji described party, not the country, should be the focus. That's why I sometimes say it's a unique case where a party owns a country, not a country having multiple parties. So I was happy to hear that kind of expression. Let me quickly say, we need to underline the fact that in past itself, several seeds are there to understand why this tension will not go quickly between these two big nations. First of all, if we look at the history, even in a cursory fashion, they were not, first of all, one China, one India, the way we have them today. They were not territorial states as we are constantly claiming to be today. They were having frontiers and not borders. So, Mir of Hunza, for example, could pay obeisance at Lhasa or Lahore, depending on who was stronger. And that kind of flexibility began to disappear with the coming of colonialism. And both of them experienced subjugation of European colonialism. But then they were fighting for that imperialism, which again produced certain working together. But the fact that Chinese had violent liberation and we had a peaceful transfer of power, the dominant narrative of non-violence giving us liberation in India, and the dominant narrative of violence giving liberation to China, and therefore China kind of undoing everything that was imperial, and India sustaining those treaties and arrangements that came from the British colonialism, was again very, very deep difference. And of course, both of them produced very different political systems. Of course, initially in 1950s, the China-India Bhai euphoria was because two ancient civilizations had liberated themselves. They wanted to transform Asia or the world working together, but that was extremely superficial. And despite some concessions being made by India, ultimately ended in a war that saw about 2 decades of no engagement virtually, even among academia, no interest in China from 1960s to almost 1980s. From 1980s, we started, Rajiv Gandhi started a new chapter, focusing on, as the chair said, peace and stability on the border, and therefore building the developmental relationship overall. You saw economic relationship, which is now become one-sided virtually. And in that process of 2 or 3 decades, a lot of mannerisms, mechanisms, protocols, agreements were created to ensure that peace and tranquility on the border, which over time have become ineffective. Now that brings me to the present. Why have those mannerisms and mechanisms become ineffective in resolving the border tension? The key lies in understanding the transformation that has occurred over the last 30, 40 years. The whole world talks about economic rise of China. Of course, that means only economic rise. A lot of other things have to happen for China to become a global power, as President Xi Jinping wants China to become a global power. But India also came out of what we used to call as young students Hindu rate of growth. India also saw 8, 9, 10% growth rate. And of course, 2014 and 19 elections showed us end of that 3 decades of coalition governments and a very decisive leadership coming to control. So India also transformed just like China transformed, and therefore the old-fashioned mechanisms and mannerisms were not going to work because infrastructure improved on both sides and the power projection capabilities enhanced enormously on both sides. So what we started seeing in, people sometimes relate to the coming of Xi Jinping and the new era that Xi Jinping wants to unfold. The intensity and frequency of encounters on the border increased. And the stress on existing mechanisms, mannerisms meant that their credibility and efficacy started eroding. And what we saw in this year from May onwards is simultaneous encounters at about 4 places. Now many more new gray zones added to that. So that is why the transformation has not occurred accordingly in how to maintain peace and tranquility on the border, is making those mechanisms, mannerisms ineffective. And therefore, the last 5-point agreement of 2 foreign ministers talks about the whole new set of CBMs that need to be put in place. Now, as we are today seeing India standing up to China compared to internalizing asymmetry, which was happening for quite some time, we need to underline in the present what has changed. People are now talking that, in last 4 months, the whole discussion or the mention of line of actual control is gradually disappearing from official parlance. They are both talking of border regions. We are also hearing that Indian Defense Minister, not once but several times, including his last speech in Parliament, mentioned difference of perceptions on line of actual control. That's a new semantics, if you notice. So here we are also seeing for the first time official, not just acceptance, but celebration of what is now being called the Vikas Regiment or the Special Frontier Force, which was always underneath. So you see a whole set of new quid pro quo is being built by India as India stands up to China in resolving border regions. So because of what happened on 28th August and on 7th of September, Indian forces have also moved forward and claimed certain parts, which of course they used to patrol before. Compared to what Ambassador Kanta said, some other areas where Indian forces used to patrol are not accessible to us now. So quid pro quo is clearly changing, and what is empowering India is the global international equations. You see today both United States and Russia are extremely keen to resolve India-China problems. President Trump repeatedly says he wants to do mediation in India-China relations. Russia is organizing talks one after another. It is Russians who told India that Chinese defense minister wanted a dialogue. Why is Russia so keen? Because Russia's on standing today depends on the very basic premise that they must not choose between India and China. And to do that, they must ensure dialogue continues and certain amount of equation is peaceful and stable between these 2 states. So how even the largest states today find their own stakes in ensuring stability is what is empowering Indian dialogue. For example, the way you see Japan, Australia is organizing what is called Supply Chain Resilience Initiative. The Quad is expanding. Australia is joining Malabars. It's a very different international operation which is happening. So very quickly, in next 1 minute, let me say what is happening here is India is constantly enhancing its political stature, whereas the political capital of China is eroding constantly, which is where the equation begin to change, and asymmetry doesn't become the defining feature therefore. But nevertheless, because their equations have moved now from historical bilateral to regional and global, what is going to be shifting their tussles on the border and elsewhere will be the geopolitics and not just identity crisis or the territorial sovereignty, even if both sides are beginning to talk constantly about every inch of my territory. Look at the language. Chinese have also started now doing the same thing, talking in terms of every inch of our territory. That is a bygone discourse. The new discourse is building around geopolitics, where China is interested in protecting its investments in CPEC, in China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, finding access to entire region because Daulat Beg Oldie airfield and of course another small airfield in Chushul area. India's enormous strategic advantage, and they don't want their both historical and current investments in Lhasa Sinchiam Expressway and of course the Kashgar and Peshawar Expressway. These are all both old and new investments of China, and both in finding access to this region. So increasingly, we will see that these tensions are not going to disappear very soon. So using old medicine of border talks being raised from brigade level to corps commander level, or constantly working mechanisms having 5 meetings, that's not going to solve problem, because the whole second chapter or the third chapter of equations is now opening up, as the new era in China opens under Xi Jinping, and of course, a whole new standing up of China, which is being watched by the entire periphery of China. So I think it's a time, as the foreign ministers has said many times, is to find the new equilibrium of China-India relations. And I think in that exercise, all of us are contributing, all of us are trying to understand that new equilibrium. And I think this particular talk as well is part of that conversation to discover the new equilibrium of this completely transformed two largest economies, societies, and militaries of Asia. And their stability is entirely incumbent if we have to ensure the larger region stays stable and becomes prosperous in future.